From being present, the Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions will come to order. Good morning and welcome to today's subcommittee hearing. I'd like to thank members of the subcommittee and our witnesses for being here today as we examine important and timely topics, current trends in the U.S. labor market, their benefits for American workers, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, labor market economic information and methodologies. On the 1st of June, BLS released its May 2018 Employment Situation Report, which detailed the most recent data on U.S. employment. The report found numerous encouraging developments in the American economy and workforce, including improvements to rates of unemployment, job growth, and wage growth. According to the report, unemployment is down to 3.8%, the lowest rate of unemployment in nearly 2 decades. Since May 2017, the total number of unemployed workers has dropped by 772,000 to 6.1 million people. And there's been a 28.6% drop in individuals experiencing long-term unemployment. As unemployment has fallen, the number of new jobs available across the country has risen. Since February 2017, the month after President Trump was sworn into office, the U.S. economy has added nearly 3 million jobs nationwide. In particular, healthcare, construction, manufacturing, retail trade, and mining have all experienced particularly robust job growth. This job upsurge has contributed to one of the most outstanding and astounding developments yet. For the very first time in BLS reporting history, the number of job seekers, 6.3 million Americans, has been eclipsed by the number of available jobs, 6.7 million job openings nationwide. We know that in addition to a strong job market, wage growth can help families achieve financial independence and security. According to the report, the workforce has experienced a rise in wages, with average hourly earnings increasing by 71 cents over the last 12-month period. Much of this growth can be attributed to tax reform, as well as efforts by Congress and President Trump to rein in regulatory burdens. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which House Republicans delivered last year and President Trump signed into law in December 2017, has lowered taxes for millions of Americans. 90% of workers are seeing more in their take-home pay thanks to tax reform, and the law has helped to spur powerful economic growth across the country. Strengthening the workforce and adding more jobs to the U.S. economy have been top priorities for House Republicans and the Trump administration. And tax reform has delivered bigger paychecks and greater opportunities for more Americans. Today's hearing presents an opportunity to delve into BLS's most recent information on the U.S. labor market. It recently published data on workers engaging in contingent and alternative forms of work, and to gain a better understanding of BLS products and data to ensure we, as policymakers, and the public at large can best utilize this information. I look forward to hearing from our panel of witnesses and from other members of the subcommittee today as we talk about these developments and ways to promote even greater growth for more American employers and workers. I now yield to today's subcommittee ranking member, Representative Wilson, for her opening remarks.
I want to thank Chairman Walberg for holding this hearing on current developments and trends in the U.S. labor market and the American workforce. Wage stagnation and inequality remains a burden on workers and a drag on the American economy. The top-level labor market indicators have all been moving in a positive direction since the Obama administration rescued us from the depths of the Great Recession. The number of jobs has steadily increased for over the past 7 years, with more than 18 million jobs added. The national unemployment rate has declined from 10% in 2009 to 3.8% now. However, those positive numbers have not translated into higher wages. One key reason is that link between pay and rising productivity is broken. From 1973 to 2016, the typical worker saw an increase in wages of just 13%, despite overall productivity rising almost 75%. Between 1979 and 2016, the top 1% of earners saw nearly 150% cumulative gains in annual wages, almost 4 times faster than average wage growth. Wage stagnation has become worse under this administration. As you can see from this chart, President Trump inherited an economy that was beginning to show signs of modest wage growth. See the uptick between 2012 and 2017 on the left side. However, since President Trump took office, wages have been mostly flat. Over the last year, the average American has not gotten ahead. You can see how the trend lines have flattened out in the chart. Growth in average hourly earnings on an inflation-adjusted basis was 0. And in the case of production and non-supervisory workers, who represent 4/5 of privately employed Americans, these groups actually lost ground over the last year as their real average hourly earnings have fallen. These wage trends are more than just a line on the chart. This is a real blow to workers across the country who have been working hard and struggling to get by while health care and other costs go up. The tax cut has further exacerbated income inequality. According to the Tax Policy Center, by 2027, the top 1% of households will receive 83% of the benefits from their $1.8 trillion tax scam. The proponents claim that this bill would boost workers' wages, but we can see that since the tax bill was enacted, inflation-adjusted wage growth has been 0. Meanwhile, wealthy corporations are on track to spend a record $1 trillion of this massive windfall from the Republican tax scam on individuals, on dividends, and stock buybacks that benefit shareholders and executives. We know some of the reasons why workers' wages are stagnant and income inequality continues to grow. For example, Congress and the administration have failed to update federal standards for the minimum wage and overtime. In addition, Congress has failed to strengthen workers' rights to collectively bargain for better wages, and the administration has appointed officials who are aggressively undermining the limited protections that do exist. Next week marks the 80th anniversary of the Fair Labor Standards Act, landmark legislation that provided millions of working people with protection from substandard wages. In the absence of federal action, 18 states raised their minimum wage at the beginning of this year. Earlier this week, voters in the District of Columbia joined 8 other states in phasing out the minimum wage for tipped workers. Yet many states have failed to act. And in Miami, where I live, legislation that would have provided many workers with a minimum wage of $13 an hour was vetoed by the mayor. That's why we must act at the federal level to boost the minimum wage. Committee Democrats stand ready to pass policies that boost wages and combat income inequality. We should pass the Raise the Wage Act, H.R. 15, a bill to increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour by 2024, giving more than 41 million Americans a pay increase. We should enact the Restoring Overtime Pay Act, H.R. 4505, which codifies the Obama administration's 2016 overtime rule. The Trump administration abandonment of this rule cost low and middle income salaried workers $1.2 billion per year in lost wages. Committee Democrats also support the Wage Act, H.R. 4548, legislation to improve workers' ability to bargain for better wages by strengthening workers' rights to join a union free from retaliation and establish meaningful deterrence for unscrupulous employers who interfere with these rights. I hope that we can have a serious discussion about these policies and how we can combat decades-long wage stagnation and income inequality. I thank the witnesses for joining us here today, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record, and without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearings to be submitted for the official hearing record. It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished witnesses. Mr. Stephen Moore is a distinguished visiting fellow with the Project for Economic Growth at the Heritage Foundation Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity. Welcome. Mr. Michael Ferran is a research fellow with the Project for the Study of American Capitalism at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Welcome. Dr. William Spriggs is a professor of economics at Howard University and is testifying on behalf of the AFL-CIO. Welcome. And finally, Mr. Jared Meier is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Government Accountability. Welcome to all of you. I'll now ask our witnesses to raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to affirm the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, let me just briefly remind you, I think all of you know the lighting system there, just like on the highways. Green, keep on going in your 5-minute testimony. When you see yellow, be prepared to stop. You have a minute left, and when red hits, conclude your remarks as quickly as possible. We'd appreciate that. The same will be true for our committee as we have the opportunity to ask questions. And so now I would recognize Mr. Ferran first for Mr. Moore. I'm just reading as it's put here. Let's look down there and read directly. Mr. Moore, starting from the left here and moving. We recognize you and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I was thinking, as I was preparing this testimony, that I was in this room 10 years ago when things weren't very good for the labor force. And I've been doing this for a long time. I've been in this business 30 years. I'm happy to report that the state of the American job market is as healthy as it has been probably in at least 20 years and maybe in 30 years. So it's good to report some really positive news. And we all know about the reduction in the unemployment rate that it's hit. By the way, full employment, economists have generally defined full employment as 4 to 4.5%. So when you have a 3.8% unemployment rate, that means you have a labor shortage, and that's a good problem for a country to have. We, according to the latest Labor Department report, there are about 5 million more jobs than there are people to fill them. And by the way, I think that Congresswoman Wilson really raised the most important challenge we have right now is now how do we get the wages up, because boy do we have the jobs. And so that is the challenge. But I thought I would just walk you through a few of the trends that are going on. I don't know if we can put these up on the screen. But I just thought I'd show you just a couple of quick things. Number one, this relates to what Congresswoman Wilson was talking about how do we get the wages up. I was one of the architects of the Trump tax plan. I worked very closely with my friend Larry Kudlow, who is now the National Economic Council chairman as a senior economic advisor to Trump. And I just wanted to make it very clear to all of you that the intention of that bill from the very first day we started was not to help rich people. We love rich people. We want everybody to get rich in this country, but that was not our intention. From the very first day we started working with Donald Trump about this is how do we get middle-class wages up? Because Congresswoman Wilson is exactly right. We've seen stagnation in middle income for at least the last 10 years, and our goal was to bring that number up. We've created the jobs. I think there's no question that the tax bill has been a job creator, but Ms. Wilson is right that we haven't yet seen the wage growth, and that's the big challenge. And the reason I show this chart is we do believe that the way you bring wages up is to increase the productivity of American workers and to increase investment by businesses. When businesses invest, that's when you get higher wages. You're right, we haven't seen, it's too early to tell whether that effect is going to happen, but we're very hopeful because you can see there's a very high correlation between the amount that businesses invest and the amount of that wages go up. The next chart just shows you the unemployment data, and I think you're all familiar with this. I just thought that one of the interesting things is that the U6 number, which includes people who are forced into part-time jobs because they can't find a full-time job, or people who are just discouraged workers, that number has fallen a lot as well. And I think that's one of the most important indicators of health of the labor force. The next chart is, this is one of the most important ones. The big challenge that I see for your committee in terms of continuing with a healthy economy, but also making sure that the gains are shared by everyone, is how do we get more people into the workforce? This is a problem that started with the recession, and it still hasn't been cured, which is too many people are sitting on the sidelines and are not in the labor force. And what's disturbing about this is that most people don't understand this. It is obviously true that we have 10,000 people retiring every day, baby boomers are retiring, and that is a challenge. But the big problem, if you look at this chart, is that actually older people are working more. We've actually increased the number of people, or percentage of people by age over 55 that are working. But look at the bottom, look at the young people. This is a big, big problem right now, that Americans between the age of 16 and 25 are working less. And I am a big believer, I think the statistics are very clear on this, that your future earnings are very related to when you start working. So someone who starts working at age 16 is a lot more likely to be successful later in life than someone who starts working at 20 or 22 or 24. We do a real disservice when we have policies that discourage young people from working. And the good news is for young people, the jobs are out there. We just got to get them into those jobs. So that's an important one. And I think there's one more chart I wanted to show. And this has to do with the minimum wage issue. And look, I want the highest wages for American workers. I completely share what Ms. Wilson was saying. We need to raise wages. I just reject the idea that raising the minimum wage is a very good way of doing that. And I would submit to you, if there were going to be more increases in the minimum wage, let's at least think about a policy that creates a teenage minimum wage that would be $6 or $7 an hour, so you can get those young people into the workforce. It's one of the most important things we can do for future earnings and future employment. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Ferran, I recognize you for your 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Wahlberg, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm grateful for the invitation to discuss how the work done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics serves policymakers, researchers, and ordinary people. My name is Michael Ferran. I'm a research fellow in the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and my previous research has left me pretty well acquainted with a lot of the data used and distributed by the BLS, in particular the Current Population Survey, which provides a lot of the information that is used in the BLS's monthly update on the status of the economy. The underlying goal of my testimony is to help members of Congress better understand the BLS and the information that it provides. The main takeaways from that are that the BLS, now and throughout the past, represents some of the best economics research available. Its data collection and analytical work are generally seen as the gold standard that other economists attempt to emulate. The weak link in the chain, however, is how the BLS communicates the information that it's developed. The BLS website is the primary platform through which data users interact with the BLS, but despite efforts to make it more user-friendly, attempting to access the BLS data and actually understand it correctly can sometimes feel like you're wandering through a labyrinth. Thankfully, though, the leaders of the BLS recognize that the agency struggles in this area, and they're taking steps to improve. But improvements should include additional expanded outreach to non-economists, in addition to the outreach to researchers and policy wonks. So how can the BLS better connect with John Q. Public? And the unemployment rate is a good example of how it can do this better. Many Americans know a family member or a friend who once worked but grew discouraged and gave up looking for a job, especially during the Great Recession. But because these discouraged workers aren't actively looking for work, the BLS doesn't actually include them in its headline unemployment rate. That fact that the official unemployment measure fails to account these people as jobless has previously ignited some suspicion and distrust in the official estimates. The problem is that the definition used for unemployment by the BLS makes a great deal of sense to economists. It's accurate for what economists understand unemployment to be, but it seems arbitrary to non-economists, leading to a suspicion that policymakers are influencing the official statistics in favor of one political party or another. A better approach would be to appeal to both economists and to John Q. Public, adding additional measures of unemployment that make more intuitive sense to ordinary people, like the comprehensive jobless rate. That way, the BLS could engage with non-economists and actually provide them with a starting point to understand the national economy better. The idea behind the comprehensive jobless rate is the result of previous Mercatus Winship by Scott Winship of the Joint Economic Committee, and it represents the most holistic measure of unemployment possible. It simply counts all adults and adolescents who say they want a job as unemployed. And in doing so, it provides an upper bound on the measure of joblessness, and therefore a comparison benchmark for the official BLS unemployment measures. And in this way, it's even useful to economists. In short, the comprehensive jobless rate could be one way for the BLS to more fully engage with the general public and help them understand the overall economic situation better. In conclusion, the BLS is rightfully regarded as an objective, data-focused organization whose efforts are essential to a better understanding of the U.S. economy. Its data collection and analysis set the professional standard for many economists to follow. However, non-economists would have great difficulty using the BLS's resources to actually answer their own questions about the economy. Now, this might be unavoidable. We shouldn't necessarily expect that deep economic understanding is commonplace. And in fact, some people might argue that deep economic understanding isn't even commonplace among economists. Regardless, though, a worthwhile endeavor would be to make the data curated by the BLS more useful and more easily accessible to ordinary people, as well as to the economists who use it on a regular basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ferran. Dr. Spriggs, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fox, and I want to thank Chair Alberg and Ranking Member Wilson for inviting me, and thank you to the members of the subcommittee who are here. As the Ranking Member mentioned, the great puzzle we have is to raise the wages of American workers, not just for the sake of the workers and for our families, but for the sake of our economy. We need to have a recovery that is led by wages, not a recovery that is led by workers going into debt. The trends that started in 2010 have continued. They have not accelerated. And so that's good news that nothing has happened to slow down the rate at which we have been creating jobs, the rate at which job openings have been coming relative to the number of unemployed persons, and the labor force participation rate for African Americans has continued to recover during this expansion, chasing the unemployment rate and the employment population ratio down and up for those communities. All that's good news. The puzzle for labor economists and what we all as policymakers have to answer is, at this level of labor market tightness, why aren't wages going up? And labor economists have begun to look and challenge themselves and their theories on this point. What is becoming clear from that research is that institutions, in fact, matter. One reason economists are finding that institutions matter is that we have increased concentration of firms both at the local and at the national level. This creates an inordinate power in the hands of employers, what economists call monopsony. And it isn't always the sort of textbook, I'm the only coal mill in town or whatever, and so I'm the only employer. This is a broader sense of which employers have power over workers and their bargaining position. So if you look at what labor economists are doing now to look at that, economists Benmelick, Bergman, and Kim have bothered to look at the local level, what's the concentration of firms and what does that mean for wages? And what they have found is what we would predict, that the increasing concentration of firms at the local level has lowered the wages of workers. What are the policies that can counterbalance that phenomena? What is clear in their data is that when workers are unionized, they become the counterbalancing force. So they don't observe the negative pressure on wages for monopsony where they see higher unionization rates. This is melded together with what we know over the broader horizon of U.S. economic history in the post-war era, that when we had higher union density, wages did go up with productivity, and we saw the wages of non-union members go up as well as union members. In fact, when you decompose what has happened for non-union members, researchers have been able to document that non-union workers actually had more downward pressure on their wages from the decline in union density than wages were going down from competition with Chinese imports. So this is an important factor to consider. Over the longer span, research has now been able to document what happens to inequality broadly in our society and what happens to the link between wages and productivity because of our decline in union density. And it's quite clear that having workers' voice matters a lot. Raising the minimum wage is very important in this equation. That's the other way in which we help low-wage workers combat the type of monopsony that takes place, particularly among low-wage workers. This October will be the second longest period we have failed to raise the federal minimum wage since 1938. June will be the longest. Since there's no pending law, we will probably break those records. Congress has the ability to change the institutions, put them back to where America had them, restore to workers the voice and power that they had. That's in Congress's power. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spriggs. Mr. Meier, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Ranking Member Wilson and other members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jared Meier, and I'm a senior fellow at the Foundation for Government Accountability, which is a nonprofit research organization that promotes work at both the state and federal levels. The American economy is generating more jobs outside of the traditional employee-employer relationship, and implementing the right policies to accommodate this change is impossible if all of you don't have access to comprehensive, up-to-date data. Imagine navigating an unfamiliar city when your smartphone's out of battery, or getting married before meeting your future in-laws. Thankfully, the Bureau of Labor Statistics recently released the Contingent Worker Supplement, or what I'll refer to as the CWS, to survey the prevalence of these alternative work arrangements, like independent contracting. While the committee should applaud this release, here are 3 improvements to ensure that the survey doesn't underestimate the workforce and give an incomplete picture of how Americans are working. First, the CWS needs to capture work arrangements that are used for supplemental income. Second, the survey needs a longer look-back period given the nature of flexible work. And third, the survey needs to be released regularly. So all of us constantly hear about these online platforms like Airbnb and Lyft, but the changes to the workforce, they extend far beyond transportation and travel. Consider my mom's story. When I was growing up, my mom would go to Goodwill and buy old sweaters that she'd then sew into mittens. I grew up in Minnesota, so mittens were pretty necessary. But then during the holidays, she'd go to local craft fairs and sell them. And on a good weekend, maybe she'd sell a dozen pairs to put towards Christmas gifts to the family. But imagine what my mom could do today. With just a few clicks of a mouse and in a few minutes, she could have an online store on Etsy that could reach people all over the world, turning her hobby into a major source of income for our family. This is what technology has done for the labor force. Open more avenues for entrepreneurship. So the new CWS comes after a 13-year break from conducting the survey. During that time, there were many organizations that attempted to measure the technology-fueled change in the workforce. The consensus reached was that the number of people working as independent contractors has increased over the years. Most estimates place the share of workers who are working as freelancers, as independent contractors, between about 15% and 30% of the workforce. But according to the newly released CWS, independent contractors represent just 6.9% of the workforce. This is less than half the level of other estimates and lower from the levels of the previous CWS, which was released in 2005. Do any of us believe that there are fewer people freelancing today than in 2005, 2 years before the iPhone was first released? I don't question the accuracy of the CWS, but its design leads to an incomplete picture of the labor force because it doesn't count most independent contractors. Its main shortcoming is that it only measures alternative work if these jobs are a respondent's primary source of income. See, I earn about 20% of my income from independent contractor work, but I wouldn't be counted as participating in an alternative work arrangement under the CWS because I earn more as a full-time employee at FGA. So this decision likely explains the dramatic difference between the CWS and other reputable estimates. But something needs to change when millions of Americans are working hard to earn supplemental income, but this isn't reflected in government data. To count independent contractors, I suggest that the CWS use an earnings threshold of $600 a year rather than a majority of income. This is the same threshold that the IRS uses to require firms to issue 1099 tax forms to workers. Many workers, especially millennials, desire these types of non-traditional jobs. Less than 10% of independent contractors identified by the CWS would have preferred a traditional work arrangement. And the data show that independent contractors are as educated as traditional workers, they earn just as much, and they're just as secure in their jobs. Workers also value flexibility, but the CWS only considers work done during the previous week. Given the nature of freelancing work, the CWS should ask about independent contractor jobs done over the previous year. For example, a teacher may freelance as a math tutor over the summer, or a landscaper may work as a ski instructor over the winter. And rather than just being a sporadic survey, BLS should release an update to the CWS every 2 years, as it did from 1995 to 2001, but with the additional updates to give a more broader and accurate picture of the labor market. When crafting policies to help your constituents, you need access to comprehensive, up-to-date labor market data. This is why, to summarize, the CWS should measure independent contractors based on a $600 a year earning threshold. Second, use a 1-year look-back period instead of a 1 week. And third, be released every 2 years rather than us having to wait another 13 years to see this data. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks to all of our witnesses for your excellent presentations. I'll begin the questioning and yield myself 5 minutes. Mr. Moore, as you presented in your testimony, many economic trends for American workers are moving in a very positive direction. Unemployment rate at the lowest rate we've seen in 2 decades. The number of unemployed workers dropped by nearly 750,000 people. Wages are beginning to rise. In fact, for the first time on record, number of job openings, now 6.7 million, actually exceeds job seekers. Some have suggested President Trump was handed an economy that was already creating jobs and was primed for the sort of growth we're now experiencing. However, in your testimony, you point to an economic forecast which suggests growth of more than 4% in the second quarter of this year, exceeding the growth rate seen as President Obama left office. Knowing of the positive impacts of the tax law passed by Congress, is there another recent policy change impacting the current economic boom which is significant in terms of its positive financial impact on the typical American household?
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't think there's any question that the tax bill has had a very positive effect. I mean, if you look at the growth rates in the economy, we've seen just unquestionably a bump up in growth. And, you know, we had a recovery over the last 7 years, but it was the weakest recovery we'd had from a recession since the Great Depression. So it was an anemic recovery. It was a long recovery, but it was very weak with very little wage growth and not enough growth. The average growth rate from 2009, June of 2009, when the recovery began, through June of 2016 was less than 2% per year. The growth, you know, I've heard you all talking about how do we, you know, reduce income inequality? How do we reduce poverty? How do we get wages up? You have to have growth. You have to have economic growth. Now, there's some really good news that just came out literally yesterday from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta that the growth rate for the second quarter it looks like it's going to come at 4.5% to 5%. That's a phenomenal number. Congratulations. I think that we're going to see, I think, another 4 or 5 quarters of very high growth rates. So the big issue now is, you know, why did it happen? I think the tax cut, why was the tax cut so related to growth? I think the two most important things you did in the tax cut was bringing down our business tax rates. You know, it's just made America more competitive. America is a great place to invest in. One of my favorite headlines of, I think this was from last week, from the Wall Street Journal, U.S. economy is now the envy of the world. We are growing faster than virtually any other country. Europe is growing at 0.5% right now. We're growing at 4%. So I think you guys should take a lot of, you deserve a congratulations for the tax cut, but the work isn't done because we still haven't seen the wages rise enough. And I really am concerned about that we're not seeing enough young people getting into the workforce, and we need to have that happen.
Thank you very much. I saw some very compelling statistics about young people not working in the summer, for example, college students and high school students recently. Phenomenally low numbers, very, very telling. Dr. Ferran, as you state in your testimony, and I would agree, the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects and publishes information that can be very helpful not only to policymakers, but to business owners, prospective employees, and students choosing a future career. However, given that most people do not access BLS's website on a daily basis, how do they learn about current economic and labor market conditions? And how can BLS make its products more accessible and understandable to non-economists who have an interest in this information?
Thank you very much for the question. The easiest way for the BLS to make the data more accessible to non-economists is to make it more accessible to economists in the first place. The people on this panel, the people in the media that actually use this data, the people in trade associations and union associations that actually use this data to communicate with their constituents and with the people that read what they write is the first way. The second way is there's some evidence of other websites like the FRED website from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank and the IPUMS website that offer additional ideas of how to make the website more accessible.
Thank you very much. Now recognize Ranking Member Scott for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Moore, you indicated that the purpose of the tax bill was not to help the top 1%. What portion, when it finally passed, what portion of the tax benefits went to the top 1% in corporations?
So this is a key point. I'm so glad you asked about this, Representative. We believe that when you cut the corporate tax rate and the business tax rates, that a big percentage of the benefits of that go to working class Americans. That's why I showed you that chart about increasing productivity and increasing investment.
So you don't disagree with that 80% went to the top 1%
no,
in
absolutely
corporations?
not. We actually think that if you look at a Congressional Budget Office study that came out I believe it was in 2016 or 17, and I can get you that data. The Congressional Budget Office says that 70% of the benefit of cutting the business tax rate goes to workers. So
Okay, so that's the trickle-down effect.
because the way you get wages to rise is to have number two things you need: a tighter labor force, right? You need a tight labor force to have wages rise. And number two, you need workers to be more productive. And workers are more productive when they have more
And how many
computers and technology
jobs
to
are
work for.
projected to be created with the $1.5 trillion tax cut?
I'm sorry, I had
How many
a,
jobs are you projecting will be created?
from the tax bill, or?
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I mean, I think we projected that the tax bill over 10 years could create an extra 10 million jobs. I mean, so far so good. The tax cut's only been in existence for
And you've
less than
seen,
6
you've
months.
seen projections in the 300,000 range?
Sorry, monthly, or?
No, total.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question.
Well, you said 10 million. Most of the projections have been in the 300 to 600,000 range.
The 300,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question.
I guess not if you're guessing 10,000.
You know, the numbers that have come in just in the last 6 months on the unemployment have been pretty robust. I mean, we got over 200,000 in the last month. It's going to take a little, look, this isn't going to happen overnight.
That's right.
When you cut the business tax rates, it's going to take maybe a year or two for the full impact of the tax cut to kick in.
Dr. Spriggs, can you say how much the jobs have been increasing since the passage of the tax bill?
The creation of jobs has not accelerated since the passage of the tax bill. Wages have not accelerated. In fact, real wages have remained flat since the tax bill. So far, the only thing that has happened is that the trend in wages has flattened, but the trend in the terms of job creation haven't accelerated. So in order to get 10 million jobs, which would be 1 million jobs a year, we would have to see some marked acceleration in job creation, because that's a projection above trend in order for this to have an effect. And so far, we are not above trend. If you look from 2010 to today, we have been on the same path for the last 8 years. So nothing has changed either in the last 2 years. Nothing has changed since January in terms of job creation.
We've heard about the effect of minimum wage. Can you say how minimum wage affects positive or negative job growth?
So the best research we have done, and labor economists have gotten far better at being able to identify the precise effects of the minimum wage, are that it essentially doesn't do anything on job growth. It changes the nature of jobs that will be created. They will tend to be higher wage, which is the intent. When you look at the period when Congress made sure to keep the minimum wage going up with median wages, you see that broadly speaking, wages went up and we had higher productivity. So the effect of raising the minimum wage isn't so much on job growth as to the character of the jobs and the wages that go up for everyone.
What about youth employment?
Youth are the area that economists looked at first because in the old days, they were the ones who predominantly had those jobs. Today, predominantly people at the minimum wage are immigrants. That's part of the reason why we haven't found an effect on teenagers. Teenagers, unemployment, we have as many studies that say there's positive growth as negative growth. The net effect is zero when you look at all the studies, add them all up together.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes questioning. We had markup votes in Energy and Commerce. I'm sorry I had to leave. I wanted to hear the testimonies. Glad we had a chance to read those. This is certainly an opportunity amongst many to see the difference between a formula that says increase taxes, spending, and regulation to grow the economy versus reduce taxes, spending, and regulation to grow the economy. And time will bear it out. I'm betting on the last. That'll work better because it's worked throughout the course of history of our country. Mr. Moore, as you highlighted in your testimony, the growth in the U.S. economy and prospects for workers are now better than they have been in more than a decade. Much of this growth is due to our work with the President to update and modernize U.S. tax code. However, the tax code is not the only set of laws that have grown outdated and stifled workforce opportunity. Many federal labor and employment laws were written in the 1930s and 40s and have not been substantially updated in decades. In your view, what changes to our nation's labor laws are needed to continue the growth and opportunity begun under the Trump administration?
That's a good question. Look, I think we have a fundamental disagreement at this table about the effect of the minimum wage. I think that the evidence is pretty clear from the academic studies that when you raise the minimum wage, the people are mostly who feel the brunt of that are teenagers and especially minorities, because they tend to have the lower skills. I mean, I have a 17-year-old son, Congressman. I love him to death, but even I wouldn't pay him $8 an hour, right? I mean, he just doesn't know how. He doesn't have the skills. I mean, the importance of the starter job is so critical to getting people. I mean, everyone remembers the first job they had, and I remember mine. I'll give you a indication of my age. My first job, I was working for $2.10 an hour in a warehouse in Chicago, Illinois.
I was working for $1.50 at a gas
Okay, you're a
station
little older than I am.
in Chicago.
In Chicago. But my point is, you learn a lot from your first job. You learn how to show up, work skills, maybe work with a cash register or equipment and so on. In fact, and the evidence is very clear that people who are on the minimum wage, most of them, not all of them, but most of the people on the minimum wage, it's a starter job, and it's after 6 to 9 months, most of the employers pay them an increase once they get the skills and learn how to do things. The interesting thing about this minimum wage issue, because I think it is important, because remember what happened literally 6 weeks after you passed the tax cut. Two of the biggest employers in the United States, Walmart and Costco, what did they do?
Raised the minimum.
They raised their minimum wage. And this is the argument it was the argument I was making earlier. When you create a tighter labor market, as we have right now, it benefits workers. Because if you don't like your one job, you can go down the street and get another job. Yep. And that has helped create, and that's why Walmart and these companies are increasing their wages, because they have to retain their workers. Right. That's a great way to get wages up.
It's competition, yeah. Dr. Ferran, it's clear a lot has changed since 2005, which was the last time the BLS completed the contingent worker supplement. With the technology available today, hailing a ride, job sharing economy, et cetera, it's freelance work and flexibility is easier than ever. We need to know the statistics on that. How can BLS ensure this population of workers is captured in future studies in a more realistic way?
Thank you. So one of the ways that the BLS can do this is to make sure that they are targeting the right people with their surveys.
Excuse me, Dr. Ferran, I meant Dr. Meier on that. We could get that on you, but I think probably Mr. Meier is better set for that one.
Well, I'll just continue on what Dr. Ferran was responding to your question, because you brought up that this is important. We don't want people doing hard work being left out of government data. So I'll just reiterate that first, we need to measure independent contractors even if they're not getting the majority of their income from this. And I just recommended a $600 threshold because it seems to be based on how we determine other tax law along independent contractors. But also consider, you unfortunately missed the story of my mom selling mittens in Minnesota at craft fairs.
I heard about it yesterday.
Oh, well, with this survey that was currently done, it was from May 2017 was when the respondents were asked. My mom wouldn't be reflected in that because she wasn't working the alternative work arrangement at that point. So I think bumping it back to a year and looking at over a year, that $600 threshold, that would give us a much more complete picture. Though it should be noted that the BLS is releasing another supplement to the CWS that focuses just on technology-mediated work, so think of online platforms. But I care about all independent work. We want to capture the self-employed, the entrepreneurial economy, and I think by making those simple changes, actually additions rather than changes to the survey, it would go a long way to providing you with better data.
It's an amazing growing economy with all sorts of diversity to it. Thank you. My time has expired, and I now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Ms. Walberg. Be entered into the record.
Without objection and hearing none, it'll be entered.
At this time, I would also like to note that the mention of increased wages by Chair Walberg did not adjust for inflation. Real wages adjusted for inflation have not grown from May of last year. Dr. Spriggs, thank you so much for being here today, and I have a few questions. Why is it that wages aren't rising even though the unemployment rate is at historic lows? What does this tell us about the state of our labor market institutions? And what are the top 3 actions Congress should take to repair these institutions?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And briefly, before I answer your question, Walmart raised wages at the same time they announced they were letting go of thousands of workers. At the same time they were announcing they were going to do a massive stock buyback. So the net effect for workers really was 0. The net effect for the Walton family was that they got a whole lot richer. So for labor economists, this is the exact market where our elementary theory should make wages go up, because there are more job openings announced than there are people looking for work. The young people who are entering the labor market are far better educated than the older workers who are retiring. Companies have had several years of record profits. They've just been given a tax cut that gives them billions of dollars. This is exactly the environment in which our textbooks say wages should go up. If it was only the market, wages aren't going up. So it's clearly that you have to look back at our economic history, the time period that most people think we want to get back to, meaning the period from 1946 to 1979. And when you look at that period, what stands out is we relied on labor market institutions that Congress had established. Knowing the history of the Great Depression, they understood that labor markets on their own don't work. We gave workers the right to bargain. So we need to revisit and see what went wrong, because workers have been losing the right to bargain, and Congress could pass legislation, as you mentioned, that could restore that. We have not done the job to maintain the minimum wage. My first minimum wage job, we must be the same age, Chair, was $1.75, because Sears Roebuck told us, we're going to pay you 25 cents over the minimum wage. That was their incentive to make sure that we kept the job and didn't go walking off. Today, that would be around $10 an hour. It would have been illegal. It would have been illegal to pay someone $8 an hour. Now, I was a high school student. I think I'm pretty smart, but I don't think that I'm that much smarter than today's high school student that we can justify paying them less than I got paid for my starting job. And clearly they are more productive. The third thing that Congress can do is, not only is it just help with labor standards and organizing, but when the balance of power turns against workers through labor market standards, that lowers the bargaining power of workers. So when you roll back safety standards like the beryllium rule and exposure to beryllium, when you speed up hog slaughtering lines, when you do other actions that diminish the relationship between workers and management, you undermine the whole ability of workers to bargain, and that's key to raising wages. So Congress must watch these rollbacks in labor standards.
How will the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act affect income inequality?
Well, it's weighted heavily towards those at the top. If the intent was that companies were going to use it to actually invest in capital, which would improve the productivity of workers, so far we see no signs of that. The Federal Reserve's forward-looking orders for new equipment not in defense show no signs that companies are spending any more money on physical capital, the capital that increases the productivity of workers. Instead, companies have announced over $1 trillion in stock buybacks.
Thanks, gentlelady. And now I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for participating in this important hearing. You know, I don't know how it is in other districts, but in my district, obviously we have, everybody needs workers. Right now, I'm meeting with companies, and the wage issue is, I mean, you know, truck drivers, for example, $70,000 a year and all their medical care paid for. Chemists or plant workers, $20 an hour, all their medical paid for. But yet we still have these shortages. The biggest restraint that we see, obviously the tax reforms and tax cuts and the Jobs Act has done exactly what we had hoped it would do, and that was grow the economy. We're looking at tremendous job growth throughout this country. But you cannot grow an economy without a workforce. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on all of our institutions to produce that workforce. We got a lot of people that still aren't in the workforce that need to be in the workforce. In fact, the New York Times reported that Social Security disability benefits are plummeting, which means that we're getting folks back in the workplace. And so with that, Mr. Moore, you know, this article attributed this reduction as the latest evidence that a stronger economy is pulling people back into the workforce and keeping people in the workforce. Does this report surprise you, given the strengthening in the labor market?
No, I saw that same report that you're mentioning, and it is such good news that because what happened after the last recession was that disability became a new form of welfare. So we saw a huge spike up in disability payments. It wasn't because more people were injured on the job. It was because this is the way you got paid because you couldn't find a job. As we've created, I mean, this is what I was just telling Chairman Wahlberg, I think relates to your point, is that there's so many benefits to creating a tight labor market where you know, there was a story in the New York Times a few months ago about employers literally waiting outside of the prisons. So when people were released from prison, they could get them into the workforce. I mean, this is a wonderful thing to see. I'll mention one other quick thing that is related to this whole discussion. Just yesterday, the manufacturing numbers came out. As you know, manufacturing numbers did not grow virtually at all during the first 7 years of the recovery. Manufacturing, over 90% of manufacturers are positive and bullish, and they expect to expand their operations. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. Those are high-paying, blue-collar jobs in states like Michigan and Georgia, and many of those states we went to on the campaign where, frankly, look, we had a recovery, but there were a lot of states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia where people didn't feel the recovery. Now they're starting to feel recovery.
Yeah, and again, in the 12th District, we're seeing that. We're seeing new businesses being created. And I will tell you this, you know, my folks in the 12th District are very appreciative of the increase that they've gotten in their paychecks, the increased benefits. I mean, nationwide, we're talking more than 4 million people, $6 billion. You know, that companies are putting out there. And again, you know, it's to, number one is to keep their folks because of the competitiveness in the workplace. How do you see us solving this problem, Mr. Moore, as far as, you know, we got 6.7 million jobs out there. We've got to get, you know, we got a lot of people that aren't in the workforce back to work, give them the dignity and respect they deserve.
It's a skills problem. It's a skills problem. I mean, there are a lot of workers out there that could be and should be working, but a lot of them just don't have the basic skills that are necessary. And I like what President Obama proposed, and I think President Trump has reiterated this. I love the idea of apprenticeship programs. If you do if you get an apprenticeship program and you learn how to be a plumber, or you're electrician or something, why shouldn't we give those people the same equivalent of a 4-year college degree if they're getting the kind of skill they need? I do think one of the things you all have to think about in this committee, I think it's a really important issue for the next 20 years, is what is the real valuation of a 4-year college degree, who's somebody getting a sociology degree, versus somebody who's getting a real skill? I mean, if you're a pipe fitter these days, my goodness, a pipe fitter or a welder, you can get a job for $60,000, $70,000 a year, start your own business, you can be making $100,000. There's nothing wrong, Congressman, with working with your hands, and those are getting to be better jobs all the time.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now I recognize my friend from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Again, the timing, given the fact that it's 6 months since passage of the Trump tax cuts, is appropriate to begin the process of trying to understand better the impact. And again, I think, it seems like everyone's pretty much unanimous about the value of having the Department of Labor, have the tools to track data, because otherwise we're just sort of stumbling around in the dark. If you look historically at the Reagan tax cut, the Bush tax cut, and now the Trump tax cut, what's interesting is that in the first two cases, every single House Republican voted in favor of those bills. The Trump tax cut, however, it was kind of interesting, is that there was a dozen House Republicans who voted no. 11 were concentrated in states, New Jersey, California, and New York. And the reason is because of one aspect of the bill, which has not gone into effect yet, really, which is the cap on state and local tax deduction, which Mr. Moore giddily described as death to Democrats in the lead up to the vote, which I'm sure those Republicans from those states would sort of ask themselves, what am I, chopped liver? And as well as Governor Baker from Massachusetts. Dr. Spriggs, you did actually focus on this on page 7 of your testimony about the fact that, this shoe is going to start dropping with the next tax filing in 2018, where a lot of middle-class families, and frankly, it isn't just blue states, Mr. Moore, it's going to impact states all across the country, are suddenly going to be in a totally, no-win situation in terms of how you pay for basic fundamental services like public schools, public safety, transportation, infrastructure, et cetera, which again, a large portion of that is paid for by state and local governments. So when we talk about the skills gap, the biggest vehicle is still the public school system and the career and technical schools, which again, I would say, yes, apprenticeships. I can take you up to Electric Boat in Connecticut and show how successful that's going. But frankly, we need to go deeper into the tech schools and invest there. But the bulk of that is going to come from state governments and local governments. So Dr. Spriggs, could you talk about, again, that shoe, which is still not dropped yet, in terms of capping and crippling and handcuffing the ability of state and local governments to deal with labor market issues with education and job training?
Thank you very much, Congressman Courtney, because that is the big gap that we have experienced. We have done the things to restore business dynamism. Businesses have been created because we took a more balanced approach in terms of who benefited from the Recovery Act, the ARA Recovery Act, and you need balanced income growth to generate the most number of customers, and that's what gets you business creation. But we didn't do the job in restoring public investment. And you're exactly right. It's not just the blue states. We saw teachers in Oklahoma and West Virginia. These are very much red states. Walk out because they have had their schools starved for the necessary investment, and they've seen their pupil-teacher ratios go up and up and up, and they can't do their jobs effectively. We are down over 120,000 teachers just to get back to where we were in 2008, and then you have to think about the growth in the student population. We probably need close to another 200,000 local school teachers, and you're exactly right. The states that have been squeezing on public education the most are now going to find how do they catch up with the tax bill that is going to force them to double tax their citizens. And it's that double taxation that creates the bind for the state and local governments, and it will, in many voters' eyes, appear to be unfair. Why am I paying taxes twice just to get the necessary things for my child to get educated? If I'm an employer for the workforce, I want to be educated. We have never in the history of the United States had this massive de-investment in K through 12. We are moving against the trend globally where everyone else is increasing their investment in education, and this is just going to make it that much more difficult.
And again, just to drive one last point, again, we have still not seen the true effect yet of the SALT provision in the Trump bill, which is going to really, again, start landing hard on middle-class families in 2019 and years beyond. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, because it's going to take a lot more revenue to get back to where we were, because we're falling further behind.
Thank you. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize the gentleman from Indiana, and glad to have you on our subcommittee on the committee as the newest member. Appreciate that, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A pretty good first committee. I appreciate each of the panelists who are here today. Mr. Moore, when we passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 6 months ago, before the bill passed, all of the loudest voices in your field said we'll never exceed 3% GDP. Why were they so wrong, and how good can it get moving forward?
That's a good question. You know, the economy for the last 4 quarters has been growing at about 3%, so we're there now. And you're right. Most economists who were skeptics of the tax. And by the way, this growth isn't just being driven by the tax cut. I mean, it's being driven by pro-America energy policies, by the deregulations, by a pro-business kind of atmosphere. I mean, you saw literally the day after the election, consumer and business confidence went through the roof. It didn't happen by accident. This was the America had elected a pro-business president. We'll see if this is, look, I don't want to read too much in short-term data. It's only been a year and a half since Trump has been president. The tax cut's only 6 months old. So it's a little early to make big, bold proclamations about the tax bill. All we can say is so far so good. You know, almost every economic indicator right now, almost every indicator is pointing straight north. And so this is a positive thing. One just quick thing on this SALT deduction, because this is a big issue, and I was one of the biggest advocates of eliminating the SALT deduction, and I just want to point out this because it's really important. 90% of taxpayers around the country are not affected one iota by that, because there's a $10,000 deduction on their state and local tax deduction. That means for the bottom 90%, they're completely unaffected. The top 1% pay half of the cost of the cost of getting. This was the most progressive, if you want to use that term, feature we had in the tax bill. Is half of the cost of that was paid by the richest 1%. It's one of the reasons that the tax bill is not regressive, because it's paid for by millionaires and billionaires. The very people that the people voted against the bill said they wanted to tax more. That's what you did by getting rid of the state and local tax. You come from Indiana, by the way. Indiana's a fairly modest spending state. Your taxes are pretty modest. Your spending is pretty modest. It's one of the reasons people are coming to Indiana. Why should people in Indiana have to pay higher taxes, federal taxes, to pay for high-cost services in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and California? It's just not fair. If people in New York and California and New Jersey want high-cost government services, they're certainly entitled to do it, but that should be paid for by the people who live in those states, not a person who lives in Elkhart, Indiana, in my opinion.
I appreciate that. I have a couple of more questions for you. Dr. Spriggs had me thinking a little bit when he talked about income equality, wage equality. Yeah, in your testimony, you include a very compelling graph, a 99% correlation between business investment and wages. Could you perhaps expand on that for a moment? I have a very important question to ask you after that, and I have very little time. So
it's just connecting the dots that for higher wages you have to have more productive workers. Why is an American worker paid more than a Mexican worker in Mexico? Because American workers are more productive. They produce more on the job. I don't think any economist really disputes that. So how do you get workers to be more productive? better education, better skills, certainly, so that you have more human capital, but also so they have more computers, more technology, and things to work with. I mean, a worker who works with a computer makes twice as much as one who doesn't have the computer. And I just disagree with this analysis that investment hasn't increased. If you look at the CapEx numbers, what we call CapEx, which is business capital expenditures, they've gone way up since the tax cut. And you look, if you tax something, you get less of it. If you tax something less, you get more of it. You reduced the taxes on business capital investment. That's why one of the most important things, Mr. Chairman, I think you did in this bill was the immediate expensing provision so that businesses could go out. I remember talking to Fred Smith, who is the chairman and CEO of FedEx, one of America's most successful companies, and I think FedEx employs well over 100,000, a couple 100,000 workers. And I remember talking to him. He said, "Look, you pass this thing with the expensing and the lower corporate tax reduction, we're going to start, purchasing planes, trucks, all of these things, and it's happening. It's a great story of revival."
Yeah, okay, I have 10 seconds left. Either tonight or tomorrow, we'll be passing the Farm Bill, which includes significant reforms for work requirements.
Absolutely.
Would you agree that's significant to fill our workforce gap?
We need to do that, right? I mean, look, in this day and age, I think we all agree, anybody who wants a job and has basic skills can find a job. Let's have, for food stamps and other welfare programs, work requirements. And this is a good way to get people into the workforce. You can't get anybody out of poverty if they're on welfare. Right? The first step to getting the person out of welfare out of poverty is get them into a job. So we did this, by the way, in the mid-1990s, Congressman, signed by Bill Clinton, a Democrat, and a Republican Congress. And the work for welfare requirements were the most successful things we ever did. We saw the income of those people who moved off of welfare over the next 5 or 6 years rose. Get people into a job. It's the most important thing you can do to help those families.
Thank you. My time has expired.
I thank the gentleman, and even as a Wolverine, it gives me pleasure to recognize the Buckeye, the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. And just, Mr. Moore, just to be accurate, most people on food stamps who can work do work. So let's start there. We all have heard the statement that all politics is local, and I agree with that. And so since my unemployment rate is nowhere near 3.8%, I just consider it fake news. It's just all fake news. Just like a 4% GDP is also fake news. Mr. Moore, if it was not your intent to make the rich richer with the Trump tax scam, you absolutely failed miserably, because that is exactly what the bill did. And for those people who received a small reduction in their taxes, they're paying 3 to 4 times that just trying to get health care, because my colleagues continue to try to do away with the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Spriggs, how much of the Republican tax cut has actually gone to workers?
At the moment, it's not clear to see what went to workers. Again, if it was going to be in the form of investment at their job that gave them more equipment that would increase their productivity, we haven't seen it. Productivity hasn't gone up, the investment in the equipment hasn't gone up, and so it's not clear, and their real wages haven't gone up.
So then, since you don't know, then whatever numbers they keep telling us is just made up, just more fake news, right? Tell me, who benefits from the billions in stock buybacks that the companies announced after the tax scam was passed?
So we know that the ownership of stocks is highly concentrated at the top 1% and 10%. Despite people wanting to say it's in your 401k, we have to remember that lots of workers, the majority, don't have 401ks. So the reality is this goes to a very few. And in the case of the Walmart example that I gave, this goes to one family. Essentially. This has been the effect has been a massive redistribution upward.
Okay, let me just ask, we were talking earlier about the concern that young people are not working, primarily because older people are working longer, because they can't afford to not work. This country knows that we are more than $1 billion in debt as it relates to funding pensions. We compounded the problem when we passed the tax scam and put the country $2 trillion in debt. So now we come back and we say, we're going to cut Social Security benefits and we're going to cut Medicare and Medicaid to pay for a tax cut for rich people. So if older people cannot afford to retire because they don't have the savings and or they don't have the pension, what do we do from here?
Well, we have a big problem for the generation that entered the labor market during the Great Recession. They didn't get the job to start with that was typical. They weren't able to pay into a retirement plan. We have left them in a very, very hard position. And employers have skipped over them and now want to hire new graduates. So we have that problem.
Mr. Spriggs, I don't want to, my time is really running short, so do you think it would be more effective if we put money into summer jobs instead of taking care of children at the border who we took their parents away from them? Probably be less expensive, I would guess, to just give kids summer jobs or give them better training instead of creating a problem that is costing this country billions of dollars. Let me just ask this question of all of you. You were talking about vocational education. I think it's great. I think there is absolutely nothing wrong with working with your hands. How many of you steered your kids into vocational education instead of college? Just raise your hand. Okay, I didn't think so. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the last 30 seconds I have to the ranking member, Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Dr. Spriggs, can you tell me some of the challenges involved in the gig economy?
Well, the challenges are that many of the jobs are an attempt to arbitrage labor market regulation. They attempt to find areas where we don't do a good job of regulating, and they attempt to create the myth that these aren't employees when in fact they are employees. So think of Uber. Uber is really just Louis on taxi. It's just a dispatcher, except now it's the phone. And they want to pretend that they don't have employees. They have employees. So the biggest problem is it creates huge holes in our labor standards, and that's not good for workers or for the economy or for our tax system.
I thank the gentleman and the gentlelady, and I recognize the gentlelady from Delaware, Ms. Lisa Blunt-Rochester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Wilson, and thank you also to the panel. I had the opportunity to serve as Secretary of Labor in the state of Delaware, so the issue of labor market information is vital. I believe it's vital. As we already mentioned, it's vital to policymakers, to economists, to students, to parents. And as Secretary of Labor, we had a lot of good partnerships and also products. Everything from working with schools to our workforce investment boards to the media. So one of my questions is about data itself and about the integrity and confidence and validity of it. And I'll start with Dr. Spriggs. Before becoming president, I know Mr. Trump talked about BLS unemployment data covered up a massive unreported unemployment levels and used words like fake and phony. And so I just want to get your impression. I know you worked for the Department of Labor. If you could talk a little bit about the data itself and the integrity of the data. If you just share, is it fake? Is it phony?
Well, like Dr. Ferran, I sing high praises for the BLS and for the integrity and for the way that they are very careful to be as nonpartisan as possible in their work and to be focused and to be professional. And as he mentioned, the world recognizes them as the gold standard. They do provide many products. One of the most important is their quarterly census of employment and workers that allows local workforce boards to see the flow of work and to be able to better predict where are new jobs being created within both their WIB area and within their county. So they do marvelous jobs.
Can I ask Dr. Ferran and Dr. Meier, you both mentioned it also in your testimony, Dr. Ferran, you mentioned more useful and accessible to ordinary people. Mr. Meier, you talked about updating the CWS. I guess my question is, do you support increased funding? Because I think we're seeing a decline in staffing. So how can we provide great services and great products if we don't have the people or the resources to do it? It's just a yes or no question. Do you support increased funding?
I'm an economist, so I can't give a yes or no question. But the answer is, what is efficient? What are the trade-offs for additional funding? What are the trade-offs for
Okay, Mr.
spending the money
Ferran,
more
if you
better?
can't, because you're an economist, I'll go to Mr. Meier.
I would say yes, if it would lead to better measurements that policymakers can use to put in place the best data. If it's
Excellent.
just spending for the sake of spending, then no.
We don't do that. Excellent. Okay, and then my last comment or question, my other committee is agriculture. And so I get the opportunity to be a part of the Farm Bill discussions. One of my concerns, I think all of us agree that we have these unfilled jobs and that we have a skills mismatch and that we really want people to work, whether you're Democrat or Republican. My question is, on the Farm Bill, the proposal is basically to create a massive jobs program, and I was around for welfare reform as well. This appears to be untested and underfunded. We're talking $30 per person per month. Good jobs training programs cost more than that. Dr. Spriggs, can you talk a little bit about what you think would be the impact of instituting something like this, where people would be sanctioned off and not also have good job training programs?
The work requirement changes the program into a subsidy for employers who do not raise wages, and that would be bad. So when you look at how much we subsidize Walmart and McDonald's, the two largest employers in the United States and in the world, because they fail to pay their workers sufficient wages that they do not need food assistance, it is the most inefficient system of employment in the world. No one in the world subsidizes people going to fast food restaurants to make their nation fat. But that's exactly what this legislation would do, because when you force a worker to accept a low wage in order to get the benefit, that is what you're doing. And so, no, this is a bad public policy. The far better public policy is to address why, in the name of having shortages of workers, these employers are not raising their wages. You would lower the use of food assistance if workers got paid a decent wage.
Thank you.
Because already it's the case that workers are needing food assistance.
Thank you, Dr. Spriggs. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and now I am pleased to recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Lewis, for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for your testimony today. Dr. Ferran, I want to start with you, if I may. In your testimony, you mentioned research related to the current population survey, and as we have seen, even in an economy with 3.8% unemployment, the lowest since 2000, I believe, even in an economy that may be growing at 4%, 4.2% GDP, when, in fact, CBO predicted we would only grow at 1.9%. Even in an economy this hot, we still have a problem with the sticky labor force participation rate. And I'm just wondering your analysis of the March 2018 study by the American Action Forum that found that there was some relation to opioid dependency as a part of at least the absence of nearly 1 million prime-age workers from the labor force, and would a reduction in that serious problem help?
So looking at it from a purely economical standpoint, certainly if the workers who were ill and addicted and therefore not in the labor force were actually in the labor force, economic growth would even be larger. And you wouldn't even necessarily have to have them in the labor force for that to happen, because addiction obviously hurts people's performance in their families and taking care of their loved ones and that sort of thing as well. And also, obviously, it would be much better for the people engaged who are addicted to actually have better lives as a result.
Between 1999 and 2015, this decline, this absence, results in about $700 billion loss in real GDP, real output. And that's consistent with your analyses?
That's what I've seen other economists reporting, yes.
Mr. Moore, I want to drill down a little bit on labor force participation rate. As someone who has studied macroeconomics for some time, you are quite familiar with this. The fact of the matter is we are still stuck back into the 70s era of cardigan sweaters and malaise when it comes to some of these labor force participation rate figures. Is it a matter, as one panelist said, of just merely not having a high enough livable wage, or is it a matter of the wrong incentives from some of our other public assistance programs where we have a 3.8% unemployment rate, which of course, as everyone knows, doesn't take into account a denominator that drops people off when they no longer look for work, and so it doesn't pay to get out from under some sort of dependence.
So there was a very good study that was done by Casey Mulligan, who's one of the top economists in the country at the University of Chicago, and he's probably much more of an expert on this than I am, so I'll quote some of his research on this. He has shown that if you take someone who is receiving welfare benefits, a package of welfare benefits, that because of the various laws, the phase-outs of benefits, the taxes that they would pay, that individual, it might be a mother or it might be an unemployed individual, they would lose about 50 cents of benefits for every dollar that they would earn. You know, that's a high marginal tax, right? I mean, we don't even charge wealthy people a 50% marginal tax rate. So
we often talk about that marginal rate, and that is the key in all of this, the marginal rate, the rate on the next dollar earned at the top end of the spectrum. But what you're saying and what that study says is, in fact, everyone works for after-tax income.
Well, especially people who are on welfare now who are trying to get off welfare. You know, if you, let's say you're on welfare, if you get a job that, say, pays you $40,000 a year, what Casey Mulligan is saying, guess what? You know, you're going to lose $20,000 of benefits, so your actual increase in your take-home pay is only going to be half of that. That's a high. So we should really investigate the phase-out of all of these benefits, and also the work requirement, basically, you have to work. Now, look, if you had a situation right now, like we had in 2008 and 2009, where the unemployment rate went up to 9 and 10%, a work requirement probably wouldn't work because there weren't jobs for people. But now there's plentiful jobs for people. And we just have, I mean, I just think you do a real service, not just to it's not just about reducing the cost of the programs, it's about improving people's lives by getting them into the workforce. And that is so critical. You can't have a second and third and fourth job, you know, Mr. Lewis, until you have the first job.
And that's what this is all about, and that's what work requirements are all about, and that is moving from dependence to independence. We can subsidize dependence all day long, but that doesn't move people to a more productive job and a more productive life. And I thank you for your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for your questions and appreciate the committee attentive to the issue today, as well as thank you so much for the witnesses for being here. In fact, wish we had more members here today so we would heard more from you on this important topic. We want to get things right, so thank you for being here. Ms. Wilson, it's good to have you in the ranking members chair today. Do an excellent job, and ask if you have any closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg, for holding today's hearing. I think it is vital that this committee examine the U.S. labor market trends. While strong job growth is important, we cannot neglect the fact that wage stagnation and income inequality are a decades-long problem that must be addressed. When we talk about wage stagnation and income inequality, we're talking about more than a line on a graph. Workers across the country are not getting a fair share of the wealth they help create. This means some workers are struggling to buy groceries every week to feed their families, struggling to pay rent and to keep a roof over their heads. And it means some workers are finding it almost impossible to save for their children's education so that they may have a better life. I think we can all agree that we want workers to be able to earn wages that allow them to support themselves and their families. Unfortunately, despite what we have heard today, workers' wages are not better off under this president. In fact, Since President Trump took office, wages have been mostly flat, and some workers lost ground over the last year. Workers across the country are feeling the impact of these trends in their daily lives and want us to step up and help fix the problem. But rather than pass legislation to help all workers, President Trump and Congressional Republicans passed a tax scam that only makes our historically high levels of income inequality worse. The tax giveaway to the top 1% of American earners and corporations did not lift workers' wages. It just gave wealthy corporations a massive windfall for stock buybacks that benefit shareholders and executives. We know that this is not the right approach. As we heard from Dr. Spriggs, when our policies promote broad wage growth, we're better off. When we strengthen wage protections and workers' rights to collectively bargain for better wages, we combat wage stagnation and the income inequality that leaves workers behind. That is why committee Democrats support bills to raise the minimum wage, update overtime protections, and strengthen workers' rights to join a union free from retaliation. I again want to thank our witnesses for joining us here today, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. In the words of the Northwest Ordinance and Article 8, Section 1 of the Michigan Constitution, that copied from the Northwest Ordinance, it says religion, morality, knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And I'm glad that in some of the conversation today, Mr. Moore and Mr. Banks touched on it as well, the primacy of preparing people for real-world jobs through education opportunities that expanded beyond just the status quo normal of what we've done in the past. And we are the Education and Workforce Committee. And I think aptly named that because they have to go together. We don't just educate to educate, we educate to work. And in order to work today, you have to be educated. I don't care what you're going to do. And I think this committee and this subcommittee, it's important that we, as we think of health, employment, labor, and pensions, the whole scheme of things, that we take due diligence to prepare people, to educate them early for jobs in the real world that will provide a certainty, to the best that we can humanly provide a certainty, that they're going to have a background and training experience or educational experience, forgive me, Virginia, for using that word, but educational experience that prepares them to experience the happiness that we promote in this great country. So we need to talk more about the career options, the education options to prepare people in apprentice programs, in short-term educational certification programs, whatever it is necessary to find more opportunity for people to be in that sweet spot that's special to them and become special to us, because it grows our economy, it grows our security, it grows the desire for even others, as we talk about immigration, to look at America as still the place where all the best happens in the form of opportunity. And I appreciate the fact that on this committee, we were able to pass a new CTE bill out of the House. Even the Prosper Act, that goes unique directions compared to what we've done in the past by fostering the opportunity for educational experience that meets needs as opposed to meets institutions. And I'm looking forward to see benefits of that come in a new approach to post-secondary education that challenges everyone to keep the needs of the future workers in mind. I as well think that today we had the opportunity to at least hear to some degree what needs to be done in keeping the statistics putting reports in place that make sense out of what is happening and what is available to be used in educational opportunities in our workforce experience. And I know we're going to disagree on approaches. I know we're going to do that. We have two parties here that have different points of view. I think that our approach will ultimately win out. I'd like to be proven wrong, or at least the opportunity for someone to prove that wrong. But we need good statistics, and we need good researchers to point out this is what's happening in the workforce, this is where we're at in reality, this is where we need to move toward, these are the opportunities we have. And so your testimony today, along with things that have actually happened by law and what the results will be, has been very helpful. So with that, and seeing that there is no further business to come before this subcommittee, I'll declare it adjourned.